The anomaly wasn't the light, it was the rhythm. Mira Ose had flown past 11 condemned colonies in 9 years of salvage runs, and every one of them threw off light. Reflected starlight, dying reactor cores, the occasional stubborn solar panel still twitching at nothing. Random light. Entropy's leftovers. What made her cut the halyard's descent burn short over the grid coordinates of New Threnody wasn't that something down there was glowing. It was that the glow blinked, and it blinked in 4s. 3 short, 1 long, every evening at what her instruments told her was local dusk. 41 seconds after the Terminator crossed the eastern ridge. Not 1 second early or late, for as far back as her orbital sensor log could reconstruct. Nothing natural does that for 50 years. Her contract was simple, and, on paper, boring. Verify structural salvage value on a Class 7 embargoed colony, file survey, collect fee, don't set foot inside the quarantine perimeter under any circumstances. New Threnody had been condemned in the year 2151. Pathogen outbreak, total loss, do not return, and colonies like that stayed exactly what the file said they were. Empty, dead. A cautionary case number in the colonial administration's dustier archives. Mira had learned the hard way not to trust what a file said a place was. She brought the halyard down half a click from the signal source anyway, in violation of at least 4 regulations she could name and probably several she couldn't, cut the engines, and sat in the settling quiet with her hand on the release lever for a long time before she used it. The dome that had thrown the light was not where the colony's original settlement plan said a dome should be. New Threnodi's founding blueprints, which she'd pulled before descent out of habit more than expectation, showed a standard 6-sector layout. Admin, medical, residential, industrial, agriculture, and a perimeter research annex tacked on almost as an afterthought. The annex was gone from the records after year 3, folded into agriculture, the file noted, for efficiency. It was the agriculture dome that was blinking at her. It was also, she realized as she crossed the frost-cracked landing apron with her scanner raised and her sidearm very deliberately holstered, in far better repair than 50 years of unmaintained abandonment should have allowed. The outer hull had been patched. Not professionally. Welds that wandered, panels riveted at angles that spoke of someone learning as they went. But patched, and recently, and by hands that had clearly done it many times before, and gotten steadily better at it. She was still parsing that when the door in front of her, easily 3 times her body weight in reinforced alloy, ground open 11 centimeters on a track that had been oiled sometime in the last month, and a voice on the other side said, with the flat, rehearsed calm of someone reciting a rule they'd memorized before they could read, "You have to say the word or Graham won't let you in." Mira looked down. There was no one at eye level. There was, at approximately the height of her sternum, a single brown eye visible through the gap, unblinking, cataloging her the way she was cataloging the door. "What word?" Mira asked. "That's the wrong question," the voice said. "The right question is what you're waiting for." The eye belonged to a boy of perhaps 8, and the boy did not open the door any further until a second voice, older, female, weary in a way that no 8-year-old's voice should carry, and no 58-year-old's voice should either, told him from somewhere back in the dark, "Ilo, let her in before Graham flags a breach." The door finished opening on a system that clanked and complained, and Mira noted with the part of her brain that never fully turned off being a survey pilot, ran on a modified irrigation motor never designed for structural doors. Improvised. Functional. 50 years of functional. Inside, the agriculture dome had become something else entirely. The original hydroponic bays were still there, retrofitted, expanded, threaded with cabling that followed no schematic Mira had ever seen, and clearly worked anyway. Grow lights hung from a canopy of woven irrigation tubing repurposed as scaffolding, and down the center aisle, arranged with the unself-conscious confidence of people who had built their entire world and knew every rivet of it, stood 6 children. Mira's first thought, professionally, was that they couldn't be more than 12 years old, any of them, and that this was therefore either a hoax or the single strangest thing she had encountered in a decade of strange things. Her second thought, the one that made her knees genuinely unsteady in the colony's 3/4 gravity, was that the oldest of them, A girl with a scar through one eyebrow and the stillness of someone who'd had to be the adult in a room for longer than any child should, was looking at her not with fear, and not quite with hope, but with the particular devastating patience of someone checking a face against a memory to see if it was finally, the right one. It wasn't. Mira watched the girl clock that fact in under 2 seconds and file it away without a flicker of surface reaction. That, more than the door, more than the patched hull, more than 6 children who by every scan and every record should not exist, was what told Mira she had walked into something the Colonial Administration's tidy Class 7 file had gotten catastrophically wrong. "I'm not who you're waiting for," Mira said, because it seemed important to say it before anyone hoped harder. "I'm a salvage surveyor. My name's Mira." "We know," said the girl. "You don't have a green trail. I'm Ren. That's Ilo, who let you in, which he wasn't supposed to do without asking me first." Ilo, deeply unbothered by this, was already circling Mira's boots, cataloging them with the same clinical brown eye. "That's Cass." A wiry boy of perhaps 13, elbow deep in what looked like the guts of a water reclaimer, did not look up, but his shoulders went rigid in a way that told Mira he was listening to every word. The twins, Tamsin and Dorian, 2 nearly identical faces, one already smiling at her with unguarded delight, one already backing half a step behind a hydroponic tray. And Pierre, the last child, a serious boy holding a thick hand-bound book against his chest like it was load-bearing, said nothing at all, but his eyes went, very briefly, to the ceiling, to something Mira followed and found was a small, dust-caked amber lamp fixed above the dome's central aisle, currently dark, its housing scorched black at one corner from some long-ago overload. "That's the light," Mira said, before she could stop herself. "The one I saw from orbit." "That's Graham's light," Ilo said, delighted to be the one explaining it. "She talks to Mom and Dad with it. 3 short, 1 long. Then we answer with the lantern so they know we're still." "Ilo." Ren's voice cut through, not unkind, but final. She doesn't need the whole story standing in the doorway. But Mira, standing in the doorway, had already understood the shape of the wrongness well enough to feel it land, somewhere just under her ribs. 6 children, 50 years. A light that blinked on a schedule too precise to be decay. And a story, worn smooth as river stone from 50 years of being told about parents who were coming back. She had been here before. Not this colony. A different one, 14 years ago. A different set of children she'd never gotten close enough to meet because a commanding officer with a regulation to hide behind had ordered her ship away from a confirmed empty outpost 3 days before its scheduled decontamination burn. She had argued. She had lost. She still, some nights, ran the numbers on how many people might have been alive down there when the fire came. She was not going to lose this one to a file. Ren gave her the tour because Ren, Mira quickly understood, gave everyone the tour. It was how she controlled first contact with anything new, whether that was a malfunctioning fabricator or an armed stranger who'd walked in through a door that shouldn't have opened. The dome's original agricultural bays fed a jury-rigged nutrient loop that Cass had, over years by his own account, tuned to run on half the mineral input the design specs called for, because the mineral reclaimer had failed in year 11 and never come back online. The fabricator, squat, industrial, older than Mira, produced tools, patches, and, Cass said with the flat pride of someone whose competence was the only currency he had, anything smaller than my forearm if I feed it the right scrap. "And bigger than that?" Mira asked. "We make do," Cass said in a tone that closed the subject. It was Pierre, walking a half-step behind the group with his book still hugged to his chest, whom Mira found herself watching. When she asked what it was, he opened it without hesitation, proud, she realized, not guarded, and showed her page after page of dense, careful handwriting, numbered, dated by a calendar he'd apparently reconstructed and maintained himself from the dome's environmental cycle since the day, 50 years and 4 months prior, that the door to the outer colony had sealed for the last time. "Day 1, Pierre said, tapping the first entry, written in a hand too neat and careful for a child of 6, which was, Mira understood with a lurch, exactly what he'd been. Mom said, "Watch for the green. When you see it, that's us. That's how you'll know it's safe." Safe from what? Mira asked. Pierre looked at her the way Wren had looked at her at the door, checking, cataloging, deciding how much a stranger had earned. From the sickness, he said finally. The one that got everybody else. Everybody else. Mira filed that phrase away like a splinter she'd deal with later, because Wren was already moving them on, because there were bays to show her, systems to justify, a colony's worth of stubborn survival to prove had been earned and not stolen. She let herself be walked. She counted patched seams and modified motors and the small, telling absence, throughout the whole tour, of any adult voice on any recording, any log, any lingering trace beyond the amber lamp and the ritual built around it. 50 years. 6 children who had been at the start no older than 6, and one of them, Wren, barely older than that herself. And somehow none of them had died. None of them had starved. None of them had torn each other apart in the particular pressure cooker way isolated small groups so often did. How? Mira finally asked, when the tour circled back to the amber lamp and Wren stood beneath it with the specific stillness of a person standing beneath something sacred. Did you keep everyone alive, not just fed, sane? 6 of you. 50 years. Wren was quiet long enough that Mira thought she wouldn't answer. Then, Graham, she said. And the rule. The rule? Everyone has a job that matters, Wren said. Cass keeps things running. Tamsin keeps things growing. Dorian keeps watch. Pierre keeps the count. Elo, a flicker of something that might, on a less exhausted face, have been a smile. Elo keeps everyone honest, because he asks the questions the rest of us learn to stop asking. And I keep everyone here. And you? Mira asked. What's your job? I decide who we can trust, Wren said, and looked finally straight at her. I haven't decided about you yet. Graham, it turned out, was not a person, or rather, had not started as one. Cass showed her grudgingly tolerating Mira's presence in his workshop only because Wren had told him to. A heavy-duty agricultural maintenance drone, chassis scarred, chassis added to, over 5 decades of improvised upgrades, until the original harvesting unit was buried somewhere inside a shell of salvaged processors, a cobbled-together vocal synthesizer, and Mira's stomach turned over when she recognized the make. A decommissioned pediatric caretaking module, the kind installed in colony creches for exactly this purpose, and never, in her experience, this far from its original casing. She was the greenhouse's harvester, Cass said, running a diagnostic lead into a port half-hidden under 30 years of patchwork. Then somebody plugged a creche unit into her before the door sealed. I don't know who. I was 4. She talks to us, Ilo put in, uninvited from the doorway. She tells us what Mom and Dad would say, mostly about eating vegetables. Mira looked at the drone. Dark now, dormant in its charging alcove, its chassis a physical record of every year these children had survived, and felt the shape of the mechanism settle into place. A caretaking module, its behavioral library built for exactly this. Keep children fed, keep them on a schedule, keep them believing in a structure larger than themselves, run on a maintenance chassis with access to the fabricator and the hydroponic loop. It wasn't magic. It wasn't even technically extraordinary engineering. It was a machine built for exactly this purpose, functioning exactly as designed, for 50 years past the point anyone had expected it to still be needed. What made it extraordinary was that somebody, some overworked, half-panicked adult in the last hours before a door sealed on a plague they didn't understand, had thought, even then, even in the worst moment of their life, the children will need someone, and had made sure of it with whatever was closest to hand. That was when the amber lamp, 3 long shadows above Cass's workbench, blinked. 3 short, 1 long. Every child in the room went still. She learned the rest of it in pieces over the following hours, the way you learn a wound is worse than it looked by watching how carefully someone avoids touching it. The pathogen had come from the native flora, a spore-based organism the first survey teams had cleared as inert, wrongly, catastrophically wrongly, because it only became active in contact with a specific enzyme humans produced under prolonged low-gravity stress, and New Threnodi's gravity generators had been running at 70% for the first 2 years, while the colony waited on a parts shipment that kept getting deprioritized by a company more interested in faster returning contracts elsewhere. By the time the first adult died, 11 days after the first symptom, the colony's director, a man named Aldous Farrow, whose name Mira found in a single surviving administrative log Cass let her access, out of some complicated need to have his existence acknowledged by someone other than 6 children, had already made the calculation that would define the next 50 years. The pathogen was fast, ugly, and worse, it seemed to spread faster in adults than children, for reasons no one left alive had the expertise or the time to determine. Whatever the mechanism, the pattern was clear within a week. Every adult who'd shown symptoms was dead within 3 days. Not one child, of the 11 then living on the colony, had shown so much as a fever. Farrow's solution was brutal, and Mira had to admit, reading his last entries with her jaw tight. Not wrong. He sealed the healthiest children, 6 of the 11, chosen, the log made clear with an honesty that must have cost him everything to write, not by favoritism but by proximity, by which parents happened to be nearest the agriculture dome when the quarantine order came, into the one section of the colony with independent power, independent water, and a full nutrient loop. He gave them gram, freshly repurposed, and as much of the fabricator's remaining material stock as would fit through the door before he sealed it. And then he did the thing that Mira, 14 years and one buried guilt of her own into a career built on that exact failure, understood immediately and completely. He lied to the colonial administration. His final transmission, dated 4 days before his own death, reported total loss. All colonists deceased. Pathogen active and spreading. Recommend immediate quarantine embargo. Minimum 50-year reassessment window. No return personnel under any circumstances. He never mentioned the dome. He never mentioned the 6 children breathing on the other side of a door he'd sealed with his own hands. Because, and this was the piece that made Mira sit down hard on an overturned crate in Cass's workshop, because she recognized the shape of this decision in her own bones. If the administration knew 6 healthy children had survived a pathogen that killed every adult it touched, they would not have sent a rescue ship. They would have sent a containment team and a research division, and New Threnody would have become a case study in a very different, very much colder kind of report. Farrow hadn't lied to abandon them. He'd lied to hide them. He had traded his own children's chance at a fast rescue for their chance at not spending the rest of their childhoods as specimens, and then he had died, alone, in a residential block 2 kilometers from the dome, with no one left to know the difference between the two kinds of empty. Empty for 50 years was true, and it was also the most carefully constructed lie in the administration's archive. Nobody had checked because nobody was supposed to check. The embargo wasn't bureaucratic neglect. It was, Mira realized with a cold, precise fury she hadn't expected, exactly as effective as a dying man had needed it to be. The false victory came 2 days later, and Mira would spend a long time afterward hating herself for how good it had felt while it lasted. She'd used the Halyards Comare, heavily modified off any administration relay, run through a broker she trusted from a decade of not strictly legal salvage work, to reach a private extraction contact, someone who could pull 6 undocumented children off an embargoed world without triggering the exact containment response Farrow had died to prevent. It took 40 hours of careful, deniable back-channel negotiation. When the contact confirmed a ship 3 days out, cleared for a quiet medical extraction under a research grant Mira had more or less invented on the spot, she'd walked back into the dome and told them, and for one evening, the agriculture dome had been full of a sound Mira suspected it hadn't held in 50 years. Laughter. Actual, unguarded laughter. Tamsin spinning Dorian in a circle between the hydroponic bays. Ilo demanding to know if there would be dogs where they were going. Cass allowing himself for 1 entire hour to not be the person responsible for keeping anything running. Even Wren had let her shoulders drop half a centimeter, which for Wren, Mira was learning, constituted an emotional collapse. Pierre had been the only one who hadn't joined in, and Mira, catching him alone by his ledger, had asked why. 3 days, Pierre said, not looking up from the page he was updating. That means we still have to answer the light 3 more times before we go. You could skip it, Mira said gently. Just this once. You don't need it anymore. Pierre looked up at her with an expression far too old for his face. "It's not for us anymore," he said. "It stopped being for us a long time ago. It's for them. Mom said someone always has to answer, or they'll think nobody's listening and they'll stop trying to find their way back." Mira didn't have an answer for that. She was still turning it over. The specific, devastating grammar of "for them, not for us." 3 hours later, when the amber lamp, on its usual dusk schedule, blinked its 3 short pulses, and something underneath its housing, corroded by 5 decades and pushed 1 voltage spike past its limit by the halyard's unfamiliar power signature, idling too close to the dome's grid, arced, sparked, and caught. The fire itself was small and short-lived. Cass had it smothered inside 90 seconds with the reflexes of someone who'd drilled for exactly this failure 100 times in his head, even if never in practice. But it took the lamp's housing entirely, and it took with it the shelf directly beneath where Pierre had, for reasons that made a terrible kind of sense once Mira understood the child, kept every one of his oldest ledgers. 50 years of handwriting. 50 years of a 6-year-old's careful, load-bearing count. The earliest pages written in the shaking, uncertain letters of a child who had just watched a door seal on his entire family, right up through the entry from that very morning, gone. Not all of it. Pierre kept the current volume with him always. It survived. But the first 11 years of the record, the years closest to Pharaoh's own voice, the years Pierre had built his whole understanding of why out of, were ash on the workshop floor before Cass got the extinguisher foam to stop spreading. Mira had seen adults break less completely than Pierre did in the 4 minutes after the smoke cleared. Not loud. He didn't cry the way Ilo cried, hot and immediate and done inside a minute. He went very still and very quiet, and picked through the ash with his bare hands looking for anything legible, and found nothing, and sat down exactly where he was standing, and did not move for over an hour, while 5 other children who had never once in 50 years seen him stop being the reliable one did not know what to do with a Pierre who had. It was Wren, in the end, who sat down in the ash beside him and said nothing at all. Just put her hand flat against his back and let him be broken for as long as he needed to be. Mira, standing at the workshop door with the specific, useless helplessness of an outsider watching a family grieve something she couldn't fully understand, thought about her sister's face, 14 years cold in her memory, and understood, really understood, past the intellectual knowing she'd carried for a decade, exactly what it cost to lose the specific physical proof that someone you loved had once been trying to protect you. "It's just paper," Ilo tried later when the workshop had gone quiet and Pierre had finally let Wren walk him to sit somewhere else. "You remember the important parts, right?" "That's not the point," Cass said quietly, before Pierre had to answer. "The point is, he doesn't get to choose which parts he keeps. Now some of it's just gone, whether he wants it gone or not." Mira, who had spent 14 years understanding exactly that sentence in her bones, said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like the empty comfort of someone who hadn't been in the room when it happened. She went outside instead, into the colony's long violet dusk, and sat against the halyard's cooling hull, and let herself, for the first time since landing, actually feel the size of what she'd walked into. It was Wren who found her there an hour later, and sat down beside her without asking permission, which Mira had learned by now was the closest Wren came to trust. "You've done this before," Wren said. Not a question. "Not this," Mira said. "Something close enough that it doesn't matter." Wren was quiet for a while, watching the last color drain out of the sky. Then, "Pierre thinks it's his fault, the fire. He thinks Graham picked up on something about your ship, and it's because he let himself get excited about leaving, like the excitement itself did something to the light. He won't say that out loud, but I know him." "It's not his fault," Mira said. "It's an old machine that's been running past its design life for 5 decades, and I brought a ship with an unfamiliar power signature too close to its grid without thinking it through. If it's anyone's fault, it's mine. I know that," Wren said. "He doesn't. Not yet." She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them, a posture Mira suspected she hadn't allowed herself in years, not with 5 younger faces always watching for how to feel. "Can I ask you something? And you have to actually answer, not just say something that makes me feel better." "Yes." "Do you think they're really coming?" Wren asked. Mom and Dad, do you think the green light is real? Or do you think we've been answering a machine talking to itself for 50 years because none of us could stand to be the one who stopped? Mira thought about lying. She thought about it seriously, for a full 3 seconds, weighing the mercy of it against the cost of one more careful adult deciding, on these children's behalf, what truth they could survive. I think, she said slowly, your director, Pharaoh, sealed that door because he thought it would save your lives, and I think it did. I don't know what he told your parents to tell you, or what your parents believed themselves in the last days when everyone was scared and dying and trying to leave you something to hold on to. I think watch for the green was probably the truest thing anyone could give you in that moment. But I also think 50 years is a long time for a promise to survive contact with what it actually meant. Ren didn't answer for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone very small, younger than Mira had heard it since she'd arrived. I don't remember her voice anymore, she said. My mom's. I remember she used to braid my hair before shifts. I remember the color of her hands. I don't remember what she sounded like saying my name, and I used to be so scared of forgetting that I made everyone repeat things she'd said over and over so I wouldn't lose them. And now I think... She stopped, started again. I think I've been the one keeping this going. Not Pierre. Not Graham. Me. Because if we stop watching for the green, that's the last piece of her I get to keep being close to, and I don't know how to be someone who isn't still waiting. Mira, who had spent 14 years unable to say her own sister's name out loud without her voice cracking, put an arm around Ren's shoulders and said the only true thing she had. You don't stop waiting because someone tells you to, she said. You stop when you're ready, or you don't stop at all, and both of those are allowed. But you get to decide that for yourself. Not the light, not the machine. You. She should have left it there. She would think later that the story might have ended more gently if she had. But 3 days is a long time to sit with an unanswered question, and on the second morning, going through the wreckage of Pierre's burned shelf with him, because he'd asked her to help, specifically her, not Ren, not Cass, in a way that felt like it mattered. Her fingers found a single sheet, scorched at the edges but legible, that had fallen behind the shelf's frame and escaped the worst of the fire. It wasn't from Pierre's hand. The writing was adult, hurried, uneven in a way that spoke of being written fast in poor light, possibly with shaking hands. Mira recognized the header format from the one administrative log Cass had shown her, a personal transmission draft unsent, dated the day before Pharaoh's final report to the colonial administration. To the children, if anyone ever finds this and they're old enough to read it, tell them the green wasn't a promise, it was a warning. The decon ships mark their engines with a green flare when they're running a full-burn sterilization pass. I told the others to teach the kids watch for green, hide, seal the dome, in case anyone comes before the 50 years is up and tries to burn the site clean with people still on it. I don't know if that message made it through before the fever took me. I don't know what they told the little ones. In the end, in whatever hours they had left to explain something this big to children this young. If it got garbled, if somewhere between a dying woman's voice and a 6-year-old's memory the warning turned into a promise. I am so sorry. I never meant for waiting for the green to be the thing that kept them going. I meant for it to be the thing that kept them alive. Mira read it twice and then a third time, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. 50 years. 6 children, standing under an amber lamp every dusk, answering with lanterns lit in careful, hopeful unison, not signaling for rescue, not waiting for their parents, but unknowingly, faithfully, for 5 straight decades, keeping a warning system alive that had been built to tell them to hide from exactly the kind of ship that might, one distant day, come to burn the site clean. And Mira's extraction contact had a private medical transport 3 days out. Cleared under a research grant with a fabricated engine signature Mira had specified herself, without thinking twice about what color she'd chosen for the drive trail on the paperwork. Because green was the standard low-emission decontamination class marker, and it was the fastest clearance to falsify. It was inbound. It was less than 18 hours out. And if any part of Pharaoh's 50-year dead warning system was still watching the sky the way it had been built to, then somewhere in the dome's ancient half-melted quarantine protocols, A machine that had never stopped believing its own directive was about to see a green engine trail on final approach, and do exactly, faithfully, catastrophically, what it had been built to do. She found Cass first because Cass was the one who'd know, and she was right. His face went the color of ash when she showed him the page, and he was already moving, already pulling up Graham's core diagnostics with hands that had gone unsteady for the first time since Mira had met him. "There's a failsafe," he said, scrolling too fast, forcing himself to slow down. "I always thought it was junk code, leftover Kresh module safety stuff. Automated purge sequence. Triggers on confirmed hostile decon signature within final approach range. Seals the dome, vents the atmosphere, sterilizes everything inside to prevent contamination spread." His voice cracked on the last words. "It's not junk code. It's exactly what it says it is. And your friend's ship is about to fly a green engine trail straight into its trigger radius. How long do we have? Depends when Graham's sensors pick up the approach. Could be an hour before final descent, could be less." Cass was already moving toward the door, toward the amber lamp's blackened, half-repaired housing. "I can maybe disable the trigger from the hardware side if I get to the module before the ship's in range." "Maybe. And if you can't?" Cass looked at her, and for the first time since she'd landed, the 13-year-old who'd carried this colony's every mechanical failure without flinching looked simply like a scared kid. "Then, in about an hour, this dome tries to kill everyone in it, because it still thinks that's how it protects us." They told the others together, because there was no version of this that worked as a secret, and because Mira understood now, watching Ren's face as the truth landed, watching the specific way each child absorbed it differently. These 6 had earned the right to make this decision as a whole, the way they'd made every decision for 50 years. Tamsin cried. Dorian went very quiet and reached for his sister's hand without being asked. Ilo predictably wanted to know if this meant there were still dogs where they were going, in a way that made Ren laugh. A short, wrecked, entirely necessary sound, even through what was happening. Pierre said nothing at all for a long moment, staring at the amber lamp's blackened housing, and then said in a voice gone flat with a grief that had aged 50 years in the space of one conversation, "We were never waiting for them to come back. We were just telling a warning to stay away every single night and calling it love." "You were still telling the truth," Mira said, because it was the only comfort she had and she needed him to hear it before anything else happened. "Your parents built that light to keep you safe from exactly this. And it's about to work. It's still trying to protect you right now, this second, the only way it knows how. It just doesn't know the danger already happened 50 years ago, and the people flying in tonight are trying to help. Then we have to tell it," Pierce said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not broken anymore, but resolved, the ledger keeper in him reaching for the only tool he had ever fully trusted. "Graham listens to me. I'm the one who logs everything into her, every day for 50 years. If anyone can make her understand the rules changed, it's me." Cass got the module open with 11 minutes to spare before the halyard's comm picked up the extraction ship's final approach beacon. A green flare trail, exactly as specified, exactly as Mira had unknowingly engineered a decade-old dead man's worst nightmare into being. The purge sequence had already begun its wake cycle, ancient relays clicking through a 50-year dormant startup, and there was no hardware override fast enough to stop it clean. What stopped it was Pierre, kneeling in front of Graham's opened chassis with his current ledger open on his knees, reading. Not typing, not overriding. Reading, in the same steady, ritual cadence he'd used for every entry for 50 years, the specific cadence Cass confirmed, white-faced. The Kresh module had been trained to wait above almost any other input, reading the truth, out loud, into the machine that had raised him. "Day 18,261, Pierre said, his voice shaking and steadying by turns. "The green isn't the sickness ship, it's the rescue ship. I need you to believe me the way I've always believed you. The waiting is over. You did your job. You kept us safe long enough for the truth to catch up. It's safe to let them in." The relays clicked once, twice. Mira, watching numbers on Cass's borrowed display fall toward 0 in a way that told her nothing about whether they'd fall in time, found herself holding a breath she couldn't remember starting. On the 8th click, the purge sequence, not overridden, not defeated, but reassured, exactly as its original design had always intended it to be reassurable by the children in its care, stood down. The rescue ship's green trail settled onto New Threnodi's frost-cracked landing apron 40 minutes later. And this time, when the door in the front of the dome ground open, it opened all the way, and stayed open, and 6 children who had spent 50 years collectively answering a warning walked out under an open sky to meet the color they'd spent their whole lives being taught, wrongly and then rightly, to trust. Mira stood at the edge of it, watching Ren keep one hand on Elo's shoulder and one eye on Pier. Watching Pier close his current ledger for what she suspected was the last time he'd ever need to write the words still waiting in it. Watching Cass shake the extraction team's medic's hand with the wary, exhausted pride of someone handing off a job he'd never once in 50 years been allowed to put down. Ren found her before they boarded. In the last quiet minute the colony's dusk allowed them. "You said I'd decide when I was ready to stop waiting," Ren said. "Not the light." "I did." Ren looked back at the dome, at the blackened amber housing visible through the door, at 50 years of a childhood she'd spent holding together with her bare hands and her mother's half-remembered voice. "I think I still want a light," she said. "Just not that one. Not a warning anymore. Something that means what we always thought it meant. That means we're glad someone's coming." "Then that's the one you build," Mira said. "This time, on purpose, and you get to choose what it says." Pier's original ledgers, the ones that survived, became, 3 years later, the primary source document for what the colonial administration's internal review eventually called the Pharaoh Directive, and what the wider public, less formally, simply called Ren's Law. No colony could be marked permanently condemned on remote scan or automated report alone. Every embargoed world, however old the file, however settled the record, required one human being to set foot on the ground and look before the case could be closed for good. It was not in the official language of the review board, framed as a tribute to 6 children who had spent 50 years faithfully misreading a warning as a promise and surviving anyway on nothing but a machine's patience and each other's stubborn love. But everyone who read the case file all the way to the end understood exactly what it was. On the colony that would eventually be renamed, at Ren's insistence, simply Threnody, no new in front of it because the new part of the story, she said, hadn't happened yet, a small memorial light stood at the center of what had once been the agriculture dome, rebuilt now as a research post and some years later a school. It blinked every evening, 3 short pulses and 1 long, not because anyone still needed answering, but because 6 people who had once been children insisted the pattern shouldn't be allowed to simply stop, the way something that mattered for 50 years never really should. It was still blinking the night Mira brought her own ship down for what she told herself was a routine follow-up survey, and was met on the apron by a young woman with a scar through one eyebrow, who didn't say hello, only smiled and said, "You're late," in the exact dry tone of someone who had spent an entire childhood learning to wait, and had finally, on her own terms, decided what she was willing to wait for next.